everyone, my name is Brian Beck. I am the host of the Wardens of the Midwest channel and the tournament organizer for the Chicago Games Plus tournaments that we often put battle reports up for. And welcome to our first episode of our new player's guide. I'm coming to you here from my home dungeon, hoping that I can help if you're a new player who's getting into this game. So what this video is for: you've decided to try out a Song of Ice and Fire, the miniatures game. Maybe you're a fan of the books or the shows, you discovered there's a game. Maybe you're a Warhammer Fantasy or an Age of Sigmar player, and you wanted to try a game that was a little cheaper. Maybe you just have a friend who's trying to get you into the game. Whatever the reason, this video series is aimed at providing a guide for new players to get into the game. Buy the models and accessories they need and get into this fantastic miniatures game. Now, what this guide is not intended to do is to persuade you to play Song in the first place. Imperial Minis and Miniac have put out some great videos on why this game is so wonderful. If you're looking for someone to explain why this game is great, I suggest going over there. I don't need to duplicate their content. This first video is about how to choose your faction. While this is one of the cheapest army-size miniature games out there, you're still looking at paying at least $80 for a starter box for your faction, $100 MSRP. So you probably want to pick a faction that you'll enjoy at least long enough to get into the game. And once you're addicted, maybe you'll try another faction. But first, you have to enjoy playing your first faction. So how do you choose your faction? I'd say there are three main factors players should look at when choosing a faction. First is the lore. Second is the play style of each of the faction and how easy it is to pick up. And third is the hobby and the painting interest. And we're going to go through each of those three in this episode.
Shall we begin?
Now, the first factor that you're going to look at when you're choosing a faction in the Song of Ice and Fire is probably going to be the lore. We did a poll in our local group, and I also did a poll on Discord on this question, and the vast majority of Song of Ice and Fire players had at least watched some of the show or read some of the books before getting into the game. There were one or two players who just got into the game as a Warhammer refugee without knowing anything about the lore, but most players of this game are fans of George R.R. Martin's stories before they start playing the Song of Ice and Fire miniatures game. So assuming you're in that majority of players who enjoyed the books or show before you started getting into the game, part of the draw for you is probably getting the chance to play your favorite characters. When I started playing, I immediately gravitated towards the Lannisters because I love Tyrion. He's a great character. He's smart. He's put upon. I like the guy. Peter Dinklage, of course, is great. I know other players who got into this game wanting to play Oberyn Martell or Stannis Baratheon or Jon Snow, or maybe you really like dragons. You got Rhaegal here. You can play as Daenerys Targaryen and get all three of her dragons. That's a reason to get into the game too. Fortunately, while every faction has a different play style, in this game each faction also has different commanders that in turn bring different play styles to each army. So you can usually fit the characters you like in an army that will work with how you want to play. So if you're coming to this game as a fan of the books or the show, I'd start with the characters and the houses you love. You'll enjoy the game more if you can enjoy the role-playing aspect and think of your units as characters, not just as game pieces. You'll find that most of the characters also have rules that fit their character, too. Tyrion's as the bookish strategist gives you extra tactic cards and extra uses of counterplot. Jon Snow is heroic. Daenerys commands her armies and commands her dragons. So the characters that you like probably are going to play the way that you want them to. So that really is a good starting place, is to pick a faction that has the characters that you like and that you want to play. My only recommendation here is that if you got into the game because you wanted to play as Ramsay Bolton or as Euron Greyjoy, let your opponents know, because then they should only meet you for games in a public place with lots of witnesses, and you also might want to seek professional help.
I have 7 kingdoms to look after.
Now, you didn't really need me to tell you to play characters that you like, so I think what you're probably really here to get information on is the play style of each faction. Now, because the game is true to the lore, most of the factions are going to have styles of play that fit the lore. Lannisters and Martells are strategists who try to control their opponents. Renly side Baratheons, they're essentially the Tyrells. They're wealthy, they do a lot of healing and defense. Stannis side Baratheons love fire and panic effects on top of their defense. Starks like to attack. Greyjoys pillage. Free folk are a horde army. So if you pick a faction because you like the lore, chances are good you're going to feel comfortable with how it plays. That being said, some factions are easier to play than others, though, and depending on how much of a challenge you want, you may want to start with an easier faction to learn. Also, while I said that most factions do have playstyles that fit their lore, some of them don't. Targaryen and Night's Watch in particular may not match your expectations for those armies. That being said, I'm making this video in March of 2024, right after Season 4 came out, and one thing that should not affect your decision-making at this time in Season 4 is faction balance. This game is currently better balanced than almost any other miniatures game that has different factions. For comparison, when I wrote the information for this video, the top raid commander was Varamir, Free Folk commander, at an ELO of 60. And the top raid commander in the bottom faction, Boltons, was Vargo Hoat at negative 47. The top raid commander in the bottom non-Bolton faction, and Boltons are kind of an exception, they're not really a full faction the way the others are, but the top raid commander in the bottom non-Bolton faction, which was Lannisters, was Tyrion at negative 13. So if you took two players at the same rating, so two players that are equal in ability, one playing Varamir and the other playing Tyrion, the ratings predict that the Varamir player would only win about 60% of the time. That's a lot to play. There's a lot to play for there. There's not any faction or commander that you can pick right now that you're just going to automatically win games with. If you have that same matchup with Varamir versus Vargo Hoat and Boltons, that goes up to only 65%. It's still not certain. Player skill dominates over faction rating in Song of Ice and Fire quite a bit. If we put in my rating playing Vargo and Boltons against an average 1500 rated player with Varamir, the system predicts I'm going to win almost 80% of the time. If we put in a mere 100 point rating difference, it's almost going to be an even matchup. One of our recent tournaments, we had one of our top players almost won the entire tournament going undefeated, playing Boltons in Season 3 when they were even worse. So my point is, there's no faction in Song, at least as of Season 4, where taking the faction is going to guarantee you win or lose. Every faction is playable. Piloting skill is more important than the faction quality. That being said, let's go faction by faction, and we're going to go in what I think is increasing the order of difficulty for a new player.
They'll bend the knee or I'll destroy them.
We're going to begin our run through the factions with House Baratheon. Now, House Baratheon, this game currently is set after the War of the Five Kings begins, after Robert Baratheon is dead. So you can't currently play Robert Baratheon, but we understand from CMON that he's going to be available as commander once the Tactics game comes out, and they kind of go past the current timeline. But at the moment, House Baratheon is Renly Baratheon and Stannis Baratheon as the two leaders. After the Season 4 update, I think Baratheons are probably going to be the easiest faction for a new player to learn. Their style focuses on defense and retaliation. They've got some of the best armor and healing in the game. They can outgrind almost anything. Their tactics deck features key cards like Baratheon Conviction, lets you heal and give out tokens when you pass panic tests. Baratheon Justice lets you give out tokens when you get attacked. Final Strike, one of the signature cards of the Baratheons, deals as many hits to an opponent as you take wounds from a melee attack. So Lance Cavalry charges you, you take 10 wounds, you do 10 hits back to them and punish them for having the audacity to attack you. The Baratheon faction is unique in having the loyalty system. The way that works, each commander in the Baratheons is loyal to either Stannis or Renly, and you can't have units from both loyalties. There are several units in NCU, non-combat units. I'm going to refer to non-combat units as NCUs, the common abbreviation, throughout this video. They can be taken by both loyalties, and they share the same base tactics deck. The Renly side loyalty focuses on healing and defense. For example, frequently used Renly units include the Rose Knights, a slow but very tanky elite infantry unit. It heals every time it attacks, and it does an automatic wound every time it heals. Thornwatch, a skirmishing unit that heals every time it retreats. It can retreat after every melee attack. NCUs, a signature NCU for the Renly side is Marjorie Tyrell. An NCU, she heals a unit every time she claims a zone. The top Renly loyalty commander right now is Loras Tyrell, who augments the Renly sub-faction's healing and retaliation effects with his cards. So that's what the Renly side is all about. Healing, defense, retaliation. If you want to stand up and hold an objective and force your opponent to work really hard to kill you, Renly is the side for you. The Stannis loyalty, on the other hand, focuses more on panic and offense. Their frequently used units include the Lightbringers. They're vicious archers that spread panic when the targets fail their panic tests. The Kingsmen are a powerful offensive elite infantry unit. They're a beast in combat, and they're very hard to kill. And Melisandre, an NCU, she sacrifices 2 wounds from one of your own units to force enemies to take a panic test at a penalty and with extra wounds when they fail. The top Stannis loyalty commander right now is Stannis the Rightful Heir. He adds to the Baratheon token generation and deals powerful automatic wound effects hit through his signature card, tactics card, Tactical Approach. The main weakness of the Baratheons is a lack of maneuverability and control. Many of their units are speed 4 infantry. Even their main cavalry unit, the Champions of the Stag, it's got the best armor in the game, 2 up, meaning that on a normal hit, if you roll anything but a 1, you're going to block the hit. But their speed is 4. Which is as slow as things get in this game. They don't have much in the way of ways to cancel opponent abilities, especially on the Stannis side. The Renly side has access to Olenna Tyrell as an NCU. She turns off enemy NCU abilities, but Stannis doesn't have anything like that. So Baratheons, slow, really strong defense, really strong retaliation effects, fairly simple to play. You march up, you take objectives, you hold them. But you're likely to be outmaneuvered by stronger players. And that is the downside of playing the Baratheon faction.
Winter is coming.
Next up, after Baratheons, I think the next easiest faction for a beginner to get started with right now would be House Stark, the heroes of Song of Ice and Fire, to the extent there are heroes in A Song of Ice and Fire. House Stark is an aggressive faction with a lot of variety in their units, and a unique faction mechanic where many of their units get stronger as they lose ranks. The motto of House Stark is Winter is Coming, but in the game the motto is probably something more like, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger until it kills you. Their tactics deck focuses on charging and attacking. They have cards like Assault Orders, which lets you replace any tactics zone with an attack action, and Winter is Coming, which lets you turn off an enemy's defensive abilities and tactics cards when you charge. Popular Stark units include the Umber Berserkers. They gain extra attack dice and improve their defense and morale as they lose ranks. And the Tully Cavaliers are really a signature unit for Starks right now. They're Lance Cavalry with a devastating charge that also helps other units in the army heal with their Rally Banner ability. For NCUs, top Stark NCUs include Catelyn Stark. She influences units, so they always attack at their highest dice. Arya Stark gives infantry units free maneuvers at the start of their opponent's turn. And Eddard Stark, both versions. One version controls enemy units, prevents them from being targeted by NCU abilities, and one particularly popular version, though expensive at 6 points, lets you heal 4 times per game when a unit passes a panic test, and heal quite a few wounds when they do that. Their top commander right now for the Starks is Great John Umber. He gives his own unit automatic charges and overrun, but his cards are centered around sacrificing his own wounds, his own models, to do even more damage to an enemy. So the most aggressive, Great John is the most aggressive commander in the aggressive faction. Stark morale and defense stats are about average, but they're pretty fast. They have strong attacks and very strong cavalry, both the Tully Cavaliers and the new Umber Ravagers. They have a very straightforward offensive style, and it's not that hard to figure out. Since they have a lot of abilities that let them get stronger as they take wounds, they don't get knocked out of a game that easily. Another one of their NCUs, Lyanna Mormont, gives units abilities and get even better as other units die. So the more units that die, the stronger Leanna gets. So the Starks have this kind of comeback mechanic that makes them a little bit easier to play for a beginner, because you're never really out of the game when you're playing Starks. So Starks, solid beginner faction choice if you are looking for an aggressive play style as opposed to the Baratheon defensive style.
I'm Lord Commander of the Night's Watch.
The next faction on our list is the Night's Watch. The Watchers on the Wall, the Swords in the Darkness. Until the recent Season 4 patch, Night's Watch was considered the strongest faction in the game. It's a faction defined by elite units, strong on both offense and defense, with a tactics deck focused on buffing those already strong units. This makes them a solid all-around choice for any playstyle. They got a little bit weaker in Season 4. Their tactics deck has the unique feature that almost all their cards have a split option, where they can either be used for a one-time boost, or they can be attached to a unit where they provide a longer-lasting buff, but when the unit fails a panic test, the card falls off. Before Season 4, the cards attached until the end of the game. There was no way to remove them, and this created kind of a snowball effect where Night's Watch units just became so strong as the game went on that if you let them live, they became unstoppable. They're a little bit the new rule where their cards fall off when they fail panic tests makes them a little bit weaker, but they're still a very good faction. They still have a lot of strong options, especially for beginning players. Their infantry units generally feature 7-point infantry with both strong offensive and defensive statistics. They also are the only faction with access to artillery. The Night's Watch has the Builder Stone Thrower, which is a devastating artillery piece to infantry and, to a lesser extent, cavalry. They also have the Builder Scorpions, bolt throwers that are devastating to solo units and cavalry. They've got a few other tricks up their sleeve. They've got signature NCUs. Maester Aemon is great for healing. Corrin Halfhand, still good, provides a boost to attacks and also can sacrifice himself to prevent an enemy unit from attacking further around. You've got Sam Tarley, who gives you boosts to tactics cards. Dennis Mallister gives buffs to units. The theme that you should be seeing here is the Night's Watch is a buff faction. They are a faction that is more about making their own units really strong rather than stopping the enemy from doing their thing. So the Night's Watch is a faction. They don't have a lot of tricks or control. They're just all around good, but they don't have the kind of tactics deck support or control abilities that used to make them unstoppable. Corrin used to be even stronger. Their tactics deck used to be even stronger. They're still very good. You'll still have a great time playing them if you're a beginner. But the Night's Watch is just not the overwhelming force it used to be. It's just very good.
The Lannister always pays his debts.
Next up on our faction list is House Lannister. Were you someone who played the blue deck in Magic the Gathering? If you played Dungeons & Dragons, were you a wizard who always prepared counterspell? If so, Lannisters might be the faction for you. In contrast to the other factions we've talked about so far that are focused on carrying out their own plans, the Lannisters are all about stopping your opponent from doing what he wants. Their tactics deck is designed to shut down the opponent's abilities. They have Counterplot to cancel enemy tactics cards, Intrigue and Subterfuge to cancel enemy NCU abilities, Subjugation of Power cancels enemy unit abilities, and Bribery shuts down an enemy's attacks. These are all their base deck cards. That's not even getting into their commander cards. Lannister units have great armor and a lot of panic tricks, but they tend to be as slow as Baratheons without the offensive capabilities of Baratheons. The morale also isn't as good as Baratheons. A typical example is the Lannister Guardsmen. They're a 5-point basic infantry unit, and generally units in this game. 5 points is the kind of the low-end light infantry, going up to 8 points for the top cavalry before you add any attachments in. Pretty much the vast majority of units in this game are between 5 and 8 points for their unit costs. So Lannister Guardsmen, 5-point basic infantry unit. They've got 3-up armor, meaning that on a normal hit, they'll block the hit on a die roll of 3 or above. And they've got the strong Lannister Supremacy Retaliation Order that forces the enemy to take a panic test and take extra wounds if they fail when they attack you. But their speed is 4, and their attack is as weak as any 5-point infantry in the game. Gregor Clegane, as a commander, adds a strong offensive punch to the Lannister forces, but most Lannister armies are generally better at control and defense. Lannister NCUs continue the control theme, as a signature NCU, Lord Tywin Lannister himself, a 6-point NCU, so one of the most expensive NCUs in the game. He delivers the devastating once-per-game ability, the Reigns of Castamere, that can shut down and doom an enemy unit. Maester Pycelle hands out weakened tokens. Qyburn forces NCUs to avoid taking zones, or else their units will take vulnerable tokens. Tyrion, as an NCU, will increase your hand size and lets you grab an extra free counterplot once per game. They are a tricky faction. They're tough to play well without knowing what your opponents can do. As any control faction, right? If the way you win is by stopping your opponent, you need to know what your opponent does to really do that effectively, which makes them a little tougher for beginners than the first 3 factions we talked about. But with their toughness and their retaliation effects, they are more forgiving to a beginner than the other control faction this game foretells. So if you're starting out and you like the Lannisters, hopefully you like them because you admire their sneakiness and not because of the whole incest thing. If you're into that kind of play, then House Lannister may be the right house for you.
You're here to bend the knee.
That brings us to House Targaryen, the House of Fire and Blood and Dragons. If you like to outmaneuver and crush your enemies, Targaryens may be the faction for you. Targaryens are the glass cannons of Song of Ice and Fire miniatures. They're fast, they're powerful, but they don't really have armor. The faction identity right now for Targaryens centers around the Dothraki, their cavalry, and the dragons. The Dothraki Screamers are a central unit to the factions. They're 6 points. They have speed 6 and a cavalry move, so effectively they can move 18 inches in a turn. Compare that to the Lannister Guardsmen or the Baratheon Rose Knights that are infantry that will move 4 inches or march 8 inches in a turn by comparison, less than half the speed. Plus, they hit very hard with 7 dice on a 3-up, so they hit on any die roll of a 3 or greater. They also have Furious Charge. They make the enemy vulnerable when they hit, and they're sundering, so the defender's armor is less effective. They pay for all those nice abilities with weak 5-up armor, so they only block a hit on a 5 or better. If they get stuck in combat instead of killing on the charge, they're generally going to lose. They can't grind the way that Lannisters and Baratheons can, or even the way that Stark Siege can. Dragons are iconic, but they're even more of a glass cannon. They deal 4 to 6 automatic wounds when they hit infantry at full ranks, and they almost always hit because of the way their attacks work. Plus a vicious panic test on top of that, plus Drogon throws a panic token on top of that, so the enemy's more likely to fail that panic test. But they only have 8 wounds, and they have 4-up armor, so if they get caught by, say, Lance Cavalry, they're throwing 10 dice at them, sundering, then they're going to die quickly. So Dragons, really great when they're the ones attacking, not so good on defense. The Targaryen Tactics deck is not great. It offers some movement tricks and some attack buffs, but it's nothing quite as game-changing as the stronger cards that you're going to see in the Baratheon or the Lannister decks. The Targaryen Commanders bring some interesting cards into play. Probably the most played right now is Khal Drogo, just for straightforward murdering your opponent. Daenerys, Queen of Meereen, has more of a control feel. She brings a bunch of cards that seem like they're imported from the Lannister deck. Daenerys, Mother of Dragons, brings dragons, as you'd expect. And Marcelin is another top commander. He is great for high activation count lists. He lets you bring extra freedmen onto the field and out-activate your opponent. Targaryens and Starks are kind of similar in terms of their playstyle. They're both mobile, aggressive armies. But the difference, Targaryens are even faster and more maneuverable than Starks, and they hit harder, but they don't have as many tricks as the Starks, and they don't have the staying power of the Starks. The Targaryen strategy is all about jockeying for position, so that when they hit, they're hitting so hard that the opponent doesn't get to hit back, as opposed to the Starks that are just hitting hard and are able to, hopefully are hitting the enemy hard enough that they can survive the counterattack. Targaryens just don't want to be counterattacked. They don't want to allow the enemy to counterattack at all. So if your playstyle focuses on being really fast, outmaneuvering your opponent, and then hitting them so hard they can't hit back, Targaryen is your faction.
I'm Theon Greyjoy, son of Balon, heir to the Iron Islands.
That brings us to House Greyjoy. What is dead may never die, but rises again, harder and stronger. The Greyjoy faction is built around healing and pillage mechanics. The pillage mechanic is mostly unique to Greyjoy. There's one neutral unit, the Lysene Sellswords, that have it. But generally, the Greyjoy faction is the only one that has pillage. And the way pillage works is when a unit kills a rank from the enemy, the unit gains a pillage token, and they can gain up to 2 pillage tokens. 1 pillage token gives you a morale boost, 2 pillage tokens gives you an attack boost, and then each unit in the faction has their own unique boosts that come with those pillage tokens. So they get stronger as they kill things. That's what the Greyjoys are all about. They also have really good healing, which you may not have expected if you're coming in from the lore. But if you don't kill the Greyjoy unit, they're probably going to heal back to full quickly, and then they're going to come back and kill you. And even if you do kill one, they have cards that keep them alive, and an NCU, Balon, that revives them from the dead. What they pay for all those healing and resurrection abilities in units that have relatively low morale and armor, and that don't reach that full strength until they've added some pillage tokens by either killing a few ranks of enemy units or using some of their abilities to get there. So signature units in the Greyjoy faction, for example, the Silenced Men that have a very strong attack, good morale, 5-up morale, but weak armor, 5-up armor. They have, for a 7-point infantry unit, 5-up armor is not all that great. You usually expect it to be better than that. But they hit very hard, and they've got Dauntless, so they heal when they pass Panic Test. The signature NCU in the Greyjoy faction right now would be Balon Greyjoy, and he brings the amazingly powerful ability that when he activates, instead of claiming a zone once per game, he can bring a unit back onto the field on the flank within 6 inches of the flank edge of the table. If the unit hadn't activated earlier that round, it comes on unactivated, and it comes back on at full strength and with all the pillage tokens it had when it died. So Balon is basically bringing back a fully powered and usually elite infantry unit when they come back onto the field. Weaknesses: low armor. They don't have cavalry. Greyjoys are pirates and Vikings that fight best on ships, so they're not exactly horsemen. They don't have cavalry that other factions have, but they're really hard to kill. So if you are interested in that kind of trick, units that resurrect, units that heal easily, and units that get stronger as they kill things, that's what the Greyjoys are all about, and they might be the faction for you.
I'm going to hear you confess before you die.
Now we're going to get into a few of the more beginner-unfriendly factions, starting with House Martell. Unbowed, Unbent, and Unbroken. They are the second faction in this game that has a heavy control faction. They're also one of the newer factions. I like to think of them as a blend of the Lannister control with Targaryen mobility. If you finish a game with Martells and your opponent isn't angry and cursing at having their plans spoiled, then you're probably playing Martells wrong. Martells feature elite, highly mobile units with average to low defense. Key units include the Sand Skirmishers. They're an elite hybrid unit that moves and shoots with its quick-fire ability. And Starfall Outriders. Those are light cavalry. They have rally cries, so they heal when they charge. They heal when they attack. And they have critical blow. They zoom around the board. They charge in at the right moment for support and to take off a surprisingly high number of wounds as well. Martells have one of the strongest and trickiest decks in the game. They're focused on debuffs. Their most feared card is Rising Temperatures, which in rounds 4 through 6 prevents a unit from being targeted by friendly tactics cards, imposes a -1 to hit on attacks, and prevents all healing. Other emblematic cards of the faction include Dune Tactics, which causes a melee attack to be at the lowest attack dice, and Cunning Ploy, which lets you surprise an enemy by forfeiting one unit's activation to move another unit for free. Martells also have one of the most hated NCUs in the game, Ariane Martell. Sorry, show viewers, she only shows up in the books. She influences an enemy unit to shut off either all their orders or all their attachment abilities, and can really wreck an opponent's game plan. The Martells are a tough faction for beginners to play, because, like with Lannisters, you have to know what your opponent can do before you know how to use your tricks to stop them. But unlike Lannisters, they don't have the forgiving armor or the healing tricks to keep you from being punished if you let a unit get exposed. Martells have some of the lowest healing in the game. Their armor is not great. If you know how to use them, they're very strong and they're difficult to beat, but they're not as easy to pilot as the other factions we've talked about so far.
Got to keep moving, and that's the secret.
Next up is the Free Folk. They are the Horde faction of Song of Ice and Fire, but if you're thinking they're like Orcs or Skaven from Warhammer, you've got the wrong idea. Free Folk are an army that takes advantage of their unit synergies and their activation advantage to outscore opponents rather than simply overwhelming them with numbers. And when I talk about activation advantage, Song of Ice and Fire is a game of alternating activations. So as the round goes through, each player activates a combat unit or an NCU in turn. And we talk about number of activations in an army. So the number of non-combat units you have and the number of units you have to activate. Usually in a 40-point standard army, most armies are going to have a total of 7 activations. In the Free Folk, on the other hand, a lot of times you're going to see 9 or even 10 activations. And what that means, and when we talk about activation advantage, what that means is that after you've gone through the first 7 activations, your opponent's activated all 7 of their units, you activate 7 of your units, and then you've got 2 or 3 units left over to activate where your opponent doesn't get to respond. So you've got these kind of free activations at the end of the round. And that's what we talk about with activation advantage, and it's a really strong thing. But you're paying for it in units that are weaker to begin with. Free Folk units are cheap and they're relatively weak. Some of the main Free Folk units are the Free Folk Raiders. They're 4 points. Remember earlier in the video I said that most infantry units are 5 to 8 points. Well, in the Free Folk, the Raiders, their core infantry unit, are 4 points. They have bad armor, they have bad morale, they have a bad attack, but they give you an attachment at a 1-point discount. So they give you a 1-point attachment for free. So effectively, they're almost more like 3-point infantry. Trappers have even worse morale and worse defense and no real attack, but Hidden Traps is a very powerful sneaky order. Then they have the Thenns. The Thenns are their best defensive infantry, which still is nowhere near as good as the defensive infantry in really any other faction. They have 5 points, they've got okay armor, they've got an okay attack, and they've got an ability called Taunt, which is an effective way of keeping the opposing army from going after the cheaper supporting units. Their Free Folk Tactics deck is a very strong tactics deck, and it's focused on exploiting that strength in numbers theme. The key thematic Free Folk cards are Endless Horde, which lets you revive a unit of raiders with a raid leader. Regroup and Reform lets you shift around wounds and attachments. And Diversion Tactics, which lets you surprise an opponent by moving a different unit after one unit is attacked. So they rely on that activation advantage for a lot of their strength, with getting those last few units without the opponent having a chance to respond. And that activation advantage works particularly well with the Free Folk's strongest NCU, Lady Val. She replaces any tactics zone with a free maneuver or retreat. So a common Free Folk strategy is to hold those strong activations for the end, and then use Lady Val to get a free maneuver to move that last strong unit into position for a devastating attack. In addition to the kind of thematic infantry I've talked about, they do have a few very strong, hard-hitting units, in particular Giants and especially Mag the Mighty. a 9-point unit who does 7 attacks and does not allow defense saves, and also gets a free attack when he dies. You've also got the Frozen Shore Bear Riders, 8-point Bear Cavalry with 16 wounds, as opposed to almost every other unit in the game has 12 wounds, and they have a decent defense and a pretty strong offense as well. But generally, the Free Folk are not a faction that is about attacking and killing things. So this makes them a particularly tough faction for beginners. They don't win stand-up fights. If you're going to march your army forward and throw dice at each other, and you play Free Folk and you do that, you're going to lose. But the way that Free Folk win is they outmaneuver their opponents by positioning in a way that lets them score victory points and forces the opponents to overextend to avoid losing on points. Last year's United States Nationals was a great example of this. Mickey Arnold, one of the strongest players in the world, the host at Tourney Ground, won the tournament going 6-0 with Free Folk. And over 6 rounds, he killed a total of 37 points of units. So that means, on average, he killed 1 enemy unit each round. Not the entire army, not even close to the entire army, killed 1 unit per round. There are some aggressive Free Folk commanders, Tormund Giantsbane in particular. If you want to get out there and smash units against each other, Free Folk are not the faction for you. And that's why I placed them at the bottom of the factions for beginner friendliness.
If you think this has a happy ending, you haven't been paying attention.
Now let's talk about the last 2 sort of factions, which I do not recommend that beginners pick. The first of these is House Bolton. I do not recommend that beginners take Boltons. They're what Simon has called a mini-faction, meaning that they won't get the support and size of the 8 full factions. They only have a starter box, 1 heroes box, and then a few extra unit boxes right now, so you don't get a lot of variety for list building. Their tactics deck is one of the worst in the game. They focus on panic mechanics at a time when most factions keep getting better and better morale. So their core gimmick is making enemies fail panic tests, except that it's really hard to do that right now. So it's just not a good faction to take in Season 4. If you're an experienced player, you can try to make them work, but if you're a beginner trying to get into the game, I think you're going to find them very frustrating to try to start out with Boltons. If you really like the Boltons in the lore, that might be a reason to play them. Again, if you are getting into this game because you really want to play as Ramsay Bolton, I am kind of scared. But, you can do it. It'll be an uphill battle.
Chaos isn't a pit. Chaos is a ladder.
And finally, the last faction, sort of a faction, is the Neutrals, which is not really a faction. There's no starter box, unless you count the Bolton starter box. Neutral units can be taken by any faction other than Free Folk, but only 30% of a non-neutral army can be neutral. So in a standard 40-point game, 40 points being the standard you see for tournament play right now, only 12 points of those units can be neutrals, which is usually 1 combat unit and 1 NCU. You can, however, play the neutrals as a faction. These are generally unaligned and mercenary units. So you see things like some of the House Bolton units. Stormcrow mercenaries are both neutrals and Targaryens. Golden Company is a neutral. Lysine Sellswords are neutrals. Bloody Mummers or Brave Companions are neutrals. And the NCUs that you think of as unaligned and neutral. So Lord Varys, Littlefinger, Walder Frey, Tycho Nestoris of the Iron Bank. These are all neutral NCUs. There is a neutral deck, but there's no neutral starter box, and that makes neutrals kind of beginner unfriendly. You have to pay a lot more in separate unit boxes to field a neutral army than you would getting a starter box for any other faction. To get a neutral army together, you probably have to buy 4 starter boxes and 1 or 2 neutral heroes boxes. So you're laying out probably a total of $150 to $180 to get an army together for neutrals, whereas any other faction you are most of the way there with a starter box and 1 or 2 other unit boxes. If you like neutrals, if you really want to play as the Golden Company, or if you really want to play as the Bloody Mummers, I would recommend that you start with another faction, get the neutrals that you like to play for that faction, and then as you get into the hobby, you'll end up acquiring enough neutrals to field a full neutral army down the road. So if you really want to play Stormcrows, get Targaryens. Stormcrows work in Targaryens. If you really want to play Bloody Mummers, they kind of work in Lannisters. They kind of work in Starks. If you like Boltons, they work great. Boltons work great in Lannisters. And if you like Golden Company works pretty well in any faction. So if you want to play any of those neutrals, start with another faction we've talked about, one of the 8 full factions. Get some neutrals to supplement your army, and as you acquire those neutrals, you'll eventually have enough to field a full neutral army.
It was so beautiful that night. Snow falling.
Alright, so we've talked about all of the different faction playstyles. We've talked about the lore, but there is a third aspect which may or may not apply to you, but probably is going to apply to you at some point. That is the hobby. Most people who get into miniatures wargaming like the hobby aspect of this game. They like building and painting their miniatures, not just playing the game. I know, from my perspective, one of the things that keeps me from getting into Star Wars Armada is a lot of the value I get out of this game is all the time I get to spend painting and making my armies look good, and if I use pre-painted miniatures, then I'm not getting the value of all that extra time that I get to, all that extra enjoyment I get from painting my armies. So, because Song of Ice and Fire miniatures come pre-assembled, there's no assembly required. The aspect of assembly isn't there. You don't have to worry about how hard it is to assemble your models. If you really like assembling your models or converting, you can always take a knife to them and convert them. There are lots of people who do that. But you don't have to assemble them, and you don't have to worry as much about ease of assembly the way you do in, say, Shatterpoint, where everyone hates putting droids together. That's not an issue here. Painting, on the other hand, no Song of Ice and Fire tournament is going to require you to use painted models, but painting models is strongly encouraged. I'm recording this video the week after Adepticon, and I've been to the last 3 Adepticons. 2 years ago, you saw a lot of unpainted Song of Ice and Fire models and relatively few fully painted armies, and there were fewer players. Last year, there were, I'd say maybe half the armies were painted at the championship event and fewer in the side events. It was getting better, but there were still lots of unpainted armies. This year, the painting just took a huge step up. Almost every army was painted. I think my opponents, probably 3 or 4 out of the 5 opponents had fully painted armies. Most of them, at least, were partially painted. Almost all of the armies at the top were fully painted, and just the quality of the painting was a lot better, too. So, painting is a big part of Song of Ice and Fire, even if it's not a mandatory one. That's part of what makes this game more beginner-friendly, is that you can start playing the game without painting your models. And as we'll talk about when we get to the next new player video, how to get started once you've got your starter box, the models for each faction are color-coded. So each faction has a different color. Starks are kind of a light gray, Lannisters are red, Baratheons are yellow, Night's Watch is black. So it's very easy to tell which models belong to which factions even before you paint them. But all that being said, if you're getting into miniatures wargaming, you probably want to paint stuff. So another aspect of your faction decision is going to be the hobby aspect, and how fun you're going to find painting your models. Different factions have access to different kinds of models, and if you want to be accurate to the lore and style, you're also going to have different painting styles, and that may affect your faction decision. So a few kind of notes that help guide you with that. First, monsters and war machines. Song of Ice and Fire is a low fantasy setting, so most of the models in this game are regular medieval infantry or cavalry. It's people in armor with swords and bows and maces and hand weapons, crossbows, but no guns, no battle armor. Right? This isn't science fiction. It is medieval low fantasy. But there are a few factions that have access to other model types that you might find interesting. First up, you have the Targaryens. Of course, the House of the Dragon is the only faction with access to dragons, Daenerys' 3 children. They also have, as part of the Dothraki Horde side of the faction, the Hrakkars. Those are lions that are under the control of Dothraki horsemen. Those are all fun to paint. That might be a reason to pick Targaryens. Free folk, beyond the wall, things are a little different. Free folk get giants. There are 2 giants that come in the starter box. They have war mammoths, they have skin changers, wargs, Varamir Sixskins riding a snow bear along with his wolf pack Shadowcat and Eagle, and the Frozen Shore Bear Riders, which is a cavalry unit of spearwives riding bears. I will say, when the Free Folk were the 3rd faction that I started playing, and one of the attractions of the faction was getting to paint the Bear Riders, which is a unit of girls on bears. It is a very fun unit to paint. The Night's Watch, they get access to Jon Snow's Direwolf Ghost. They've also got Cold Hands riding his elk, and as I mentioned earlier, they're the only faction that has war machines with the Scorpion and the Stone Thrower. House Stark, they have the other 3 Stark direwolves who aren't dead or lost when Robert died. Grey Wind, Summer, and Shaggy Dog. Other than that, they're just humans. House Bolton, if you really want to paint a lot of dogs, they have the Bastards Girls, a unit of 4 archers and 8 dogs. In the neutrals, the Golden Company has War Elephants, but that's about it. But the other factions, Lannisters, Baratheons, Martells, and Greyjoys, sorry, those 4 factions have nothing that isn't human. Another aspect of your painting decision is colorful versus bland. If you're interested in kind of the bright colors and pageantry of medieval knights, if you were someone who got into, say, the Bretonnians and Warhammer because you wanted to paint, the brightly colored flags and lances, then Lannisters, Baratheons, Martells, and to some extent the Starks, at least the Tully subfaction, can scratch that itch. Targaryens don't have knights, but they do have the kind of Spartan-looking Unsullied and the Mongol Horde, Dothraki. Night's Watch and Free Folk, and most of the Starks, on the other hand, tend towards bland or neutral colors. Night's Watch in particular, as we know from the books, Night's Watch are defined by wearing black. So Night's Watch, you're painting a lot of black, which might also be a good thing for you if you want an easier army to paint and you don't want to get into all those colors. Night's Watch make it a little easier. You just paint everything black. Greyjoys have some more room for variation just because there's not as much in the lore as to kind of what colors they wear. They also do have some more fun in basing. You see a lot of people have done fun things with their Greyjoys, putting them on ship decks or putting them on beaches and having fun with the movement trays and basing that way. If you are interested in painting female characters and soldiers, every faction has a few female NCUs, but the factions with the most female options would be the Martells. Outriders and Dune Vipers are all women, and then the Skirmishers and Darkstar Retinue are mixed. And the Free Folk, they have Spearwives and Bear Riders who are all women. Ultimately, the hobby aspect of choosing a faction is a matter of personal preference. It really depends on just what you want to do. If what you want to do is paint intricate details on knights, then Lannisters and Baratheons might be for you. If you want to try to do justice to the descriptions of characters like Marjorie Tyrell, Sansa Stark, Arianne Martell, or Lady Val, then pick those factions. Or if you just want to have some models that you can quickly paint in shades of black and brown and get painted models on the table quickly, there are factions for that as well: the Night's Watch, the Free Folk, and the Starks. So with that, as you're getting into this game, the first thing you have to do is choose a faction, and I hope this guide has been helpful for you. Stay tuned. We're going to have other new player guides that get into what to do once you've got your starter box, what to do when you want to enter, how to go about making lists, your first lists, how to go about entering tournaments, all that good stuff. And I'm going to hope that this series is helpful for introducing beginners to this wonderful miniatures game, which has already gotten better since I've started playing it, and looks like it is going to keep getting better going forward. So thanks for watching.